Something is happening in the world of personal computing right now, and if you're not paying attention, you are going to miss it. For decades, the conversation around desktop operating systems has been remarkably simple. You either used Windows or you used a Mac. Linux existed, sure, but it was the thing your IT friend talked about at dinner parties. While everyone else quietly checked their phones, it was the operating system for servers, for developers, for people who enjoyed typing commands into a terminal at 2 in the morning. It was not, by any reasonable measure, something your parents would install. But that narrative is changing, and it is not changing slowly. It is changing at a pace that has caught even the most optimistic Linux advocates off guard. Let me give you the numbers, because the numbers tell a story that opinions cannot. Linux desktop market share globally hit roughly 4.7% by the end of 2025. Now I know what you're thinking. 4.7%? That is nothing. Windows still dominates with around 71%. Mac OS sits at about 13%. How is less than 5% of the market a revolution? Here is how. Linux took almost 20 years to go from 0 to 1% market share. It hit that mark around 2011. It took another entire decade to crawl from 1% to 2% in 2021. But from 2% to 3%, that took only about 2 years. And from 3% to 4%, less than a single year. Do you see the pattern? This is not linear growth, this is acceleration. And if current trends hold, analysts are projecting Linux could reach 6% global desktop market share by late 2026. That trajectory represents close to 100 million desktop machines running Linux worldwide. But the raw percentages are only part of the story. The really interesting data is regional. In India, Linux adoption hit a staggering 16.21% as of mid-2024, making it one of the highest adoption rates among any major economy on the planet. In the United States, something historic happened in June 2025. Linux crossed the 5% threshold for the first time ever. The U.S. Digital Analytics Program, which tracks visitors to federal government websites, reported that 6% of those visitors were running Linux as of August 2025. These are not hobbyists tinkering in basements. These are ordinary people browsing government websites on Linux machines. So the question is not whether Linux is growing. It clearly is. The question is why. Why now? Why, after 30 years of being the perennial underdog, is Linux suddenly part of a mainstream conversation? The answer is not one thing. It is a convergence of factors that have aligned in a way that nobody really planned, but that makes perfect sense in hindsight. And to understand what is happening, you need to understand what is going wrong with the alternatives. Let us start with Windows, because that is where most of this story begins. Windows 10 reached its end of support in October 2025. For over 1 billion users worldwide, this was not a hypothetical future problem anymore. It was immediate. Your operating system, the one you have been using comfortably for years, is no longer receiving security updates. Microsoft's answer was simple: upgrade to Windows 11. The problem is that Windows 11 has hardware requirements that many perfectly functional computers cannot meet. The TPM 2.0 requirement alone locked out hundreds of millions of machines. These are not ancient relics. We're talking about computers from 2017 and 2018 that are still perfectly capable of browsing the web, editing documents, and playing games. Microsoft essentially told these users that their hardware was obsolete, not because it could not run a modern operating system, but because it did not have a specific security chip that Microsoft decided was mandatory. For a lot of people, that was the first crack, but it got worse. Windows 11 had what can only be described as a catastrophic year in 2025. One publication compiled a list of 20 major update-related problems in 2025 alone, and that was being conservative. Updates broke BitLocker, sending users to recovery screens. Updates crashed File Explorer in the Start menu. An October 2025 update broke localhost connections, which is the loopback address that developers use constantly. If you're a developer and your local development environment suddenly stops working because of an operating system update, that is not a minor annoyance. That is your livelihood being disrupted. And then there was the AI situation. Microsoft had been aggressively pushing Copilot, its AI assistant, into every possible corner of Windows. Copilot buttons appeared in Notepad, in Paint, in Snipping Tool, in Photos, in widgets. The Windows Recall feature, announced in 2024, was delayed by an entire year because users raised serious privacy and security concerns about a feature that essentially screenshots everything you do on your computer. Instead of taking that feedback as a signal to slow down, Microsoft doubled down throughout 2025, pushing more AI integrations faster. The backlash was enormous. When Windows President Pavan Davuluri publicly described the vision of turning Windows into an agentic operating system in November 2025, his post was met with thousands of negative replies. It got so bad that he turned off replies entirely. Users were not just annoyed, they were angry. They felt that their operating system was being turned into an advertising platform and a testing ground for half-baked AI features that nobody asked for. By early 2026, Microsoft finally blinked. In a remarkable public admission, Devaluri acknowledged that Windows 11 had gone off track. The company announced a sweeping quality reset, promising to remove Copilot from several built-in apps, restore the ability to move the taskbar, reduce start menu advertisements, fix File Explorer performance, and generally focus on reliability instead of cramming in new features. It was the kind of admission that should concern anyone invested in the Windows ecosystem, because it confirmed what users had been saying for years. Microsoft had prioritized its own AI ambitions over the basic functionality of its operating system. And millions of them tried something else. They searched alternative to Windows, or how to keep using old laptop, or free operating system. And they found Linux. Specifically, they found distributions like Linux Mint, which is designed from the ground up to feel familiar to Windows users. Let me describe what happens when one of these people installs Linux Mint on the computer that Microsoft rejected. The installation takes about 15 to 20 minutes. It's guided by a simple graphical installer that asks the same basic questions any operating system asks. Language, time zone, keyboard layout, username, password. No Microsoft account, no cloud service registration, no mandatory internet connection, no screens full of toggles asking you to consent to data collection. And when the installation finishes and the computer restarts, the desktop appears, and it looks like a desktop. A taskbar at the bottom, a menu button in the lower left corner that opens a categorized list of applications, a file manager icon, a web browser icon, a system tray with a clock, a network indicator, a volume control. Everything is where you'd expect it to be. The person who has used Windows for 20 years sits down in front of this desktop and, within about 3 minutes, is using it without confusion. They click the menu, they find Firefox, they open it, they go to Gmail, it works. They go to YouTube, it works. They open the file manager, their files are there. They right-click the desktop, a context menu appears with sensible options. And then they notice something. The computer is fast, not just functional, fast. The machine that Windows told them was obsolete. The machine that struggled to run Windows 10's increasingly bloated updates boots in under 30 seconds. Applications open instantly. The fan stays quiet. The battery, if it's a laptop, lasts longer than it has in years. This is not a placebo effect. This is a measurable, reproducible difference in operating system efficiency. Linux Mint, with the Cinnamon desktop environment, uses roughly 700 to 900 megabytes of RAM at idle. That same machine running Windows 11 would use 3 to 4 times that amount. The CPU cycles that Windows dedicates to telemetry, indexing, update management, and background services are simply absent on Linux. The hardware that was always capable is finally being allowed to perform. And this moment, this specific moment when a person realizes that their computer isn't slow, that their hardware isn't obsolete, that the problem was the software all along, this is the moment that creates a Linux user for life. Because the realization isn't just technical, it's emotional. It's the understanding that you were lied to. Not explicitly, not in words, but in effect. Microsoft told you through system requirements and end-of-life policies and upgrade prompts that your computer couldn't keep up. And that was false. Your computer was fine. Microsoft's operating system was the problem. And the moment you removed the problem, the computer came back to life. That feeling, the mixture of relief and anger and liberation, that's what's driving the quiet. Migration. It's not ideology, it's not politics, it's not brand loyalty to Linux. It's the deeply personal experience of discovering that you have a choice you didn't know existed and that the choice is better than what you've been accepting. And Microsoft has no answer for it, because you cannot market your way out of a product that people are fleeing based on direct personal experience. You cannot advertise away the fact that someone's 8-year-old laptop runs better on a free operating system than it did on the one they paid for. The experience is the argument, and the argument is winning. But performance isn't the only thing pushing people toward Linux right now. If it were just about speed, Microsoft could optimize Windows, cut the bloat, slim down the background processes, and close the gap. They won't, for reasons I'll get to, but theoretically they could. The performance gap alone wouldn't be enough to sustain a migration at this scale. What's sustaining it is something deeper, something that hits people at a gut level once they start paying attention. And the word for it is trust. Trust is the invisible currency of every relationship between a user and their operating system. You trust that the software running on your machine is working for you. You trust that it's not doing things behind your back. You trust that when you close your laptop at night, it's not sending data to servers you've never heard of, cataloging your activity, building a profile of your behavior, preparing to sell that profile to advertisers or feed it to an AI model. Microsoft has systematically destroyed that trust over the last decade. And they've done it so incrementally, so gradually, one small boundary violation at a time, that most people didn't realize how much they'd lost until they experienced the alternative. Let me walk you through the timeline, because when you see it laid out sequentially, the pattern is unmistakable. Windows 10 launched in 2015 with a telemetry system that collected data about user behavior and sent it to Microsoft. The system had multiple levels: basic, enhanced, and full. But even the basic level, the minimum that could not be disabled, collected hardware specifications, application usage patterns, and system performance data. Users who dug into the settings found that fully disabling telemetry was essentially impossible without third-party tools or registry modifications that Microsoft explicitly discouraged. This was the first boundary. Microsoft was now watching what you did on your computer. Not everything, not yet, but enough to establish the infrastructure. The pipes were laid, the data was flowing. And Microsoft learned something critical from the public reaction. Most people didn't notice. Most people never opened the privacy settings. Most people never read the data collection policy. The boundary moved and the world shrugged. So they moved it again. Windows 10 introduced forced updates. Previous versions of Windows let you choose when and whether to install updates. Windows 10 removed that choice for home users entirely. Updates installed automatically, often restarting the computer without warning. People lost unsaved work. Presentations were interrupted mid-delivery. Computers restarted during overnight tasks that the user had deliberately left running. Microsoft's justification was security. Unpatched systems are vulnerable, they argued, and users can't be trusted to update on their own. This argument has a surface-level logic to it. But beneath the surface, it's a radical restructuring of who owns the computer. When Microsoft can force software onto your machine against your will, you are no longer the administrator of your own system. You are a tenant. Microsoft is the landlord, and the landlord has a master key. The world shrugged again. Complaints were widespread, but not catastrophic. Microsoft absorbed the criticism, waited for it to fade, and moved the boundary once more. Advertisements appeared in the Start menu, not third-party ads, Microsoft's own product recommendations. Suggestions to try Edge when you installed Chrome. Prompts to subscribe to Microsoft 365 when you opened a document. Notifications about OneDrive storage when you saved a file locally. The operating system you paid for was now a billboard for the company that sold it to you. Then came Windows 11, and the boundary didn't just move, it leaped. The Microsoft account requirement meant that your identity was now permanently linked to your operating system. Every time you logged in, Microsoft knew. Every application you installed through the Microsoft Store was tied to your account. Your settings, your preferences, your files if you used OneDrive, all of it aggregated under a single identity that Microsoft controlled. Widgets appeared on the taskbar, delivering a feed of news stories, weather, and content that Microsoft curated. The content was algorithmic. It was designed to capture attention, to keep you engaged, to generate ad impressions. Your desktop, the workspace you used to get things done, now contained a social media feed that you didn't ask for and couldn't fully remove without third-party modifications. And then Microsoft introduced Recall. And Recall is where the story stops being about inconvenience and starts being about something that, in any other context, would be called surveillance. Recall takes periodic screenshots of everything you do on your computer. Everything. Your emails, your messages, your banking sessions, your medical searches, your private documents, your dating app conversations, your financial records. Every single thing that appears on your screen is captured, stored locally, and indexed by an AI model so that you can later search your own activity history. Microsoft positioned this as a productivity feature, a way to find that document you were working on last Tuesday, a way to recall that website you visited but forgot to bookmark. Helpful, convenient, empowering even. But the technical reality is that your operating system is now maintaining a comprehensive visual record of your entire digital life. And that record is stored on your computer in a database that, if accessed by malware, a hacker, a disgruntled family member, or anyone who gains physical access to your machine, provides a complete, searchable visual history of everything you've ever done. Security researchers demonstrated within days of Recall's announcement that the database was stored in an unencrypted format that could be accessed by any application running on the system. Microsoft pulled the feature back, made adjustments, and reintroduced it with additional protections. But the fundamental architecture remains the same. Your operating system is photographing your activity, continuously, automatically, and storing those photographs in a searchable format. This is the point where trust doesn't just erode, it collapses. Because there is no version of this feature that is compatible with the idea that your computer works for you. A tool that works for you does what you tell it to do. A tool that photographs everything you do and builds a searchable record of your behavior is working for someone else. Even if that someone else is technically your future self, the infrastructure is the infrastructure. An infrastructure built for surveillance can be repurposed for surveillance at any time by any actor who gains access to it. Now place all of this in sequence: telemetry, forced updates, advertisements in the operating system, mandatory cloud accounts, algorithmic content feeds, AI-powered screenshot surveillance. Each step individually might be tolerable. Annoying, maybe, concerning, perhaps, but tolerable. But in sequence, the pattern is unmistakable. Each step moves in the same direction. Each step takes something away from the user and gives it to Microsoft. Each step treats the computer less like a personal tool and more like a corporate asset that the user is permitted to access under conditions that Microsoft defines and can modify at any time. And this is what's breaking the trust. Not any single feature. The trajectory, the direction, the certainty that whatever comes next will take even more, demand even more, intrude even further, because the pattern has never reversed. Microsoft has never introduced a major Windows update that gave users more privacy, more control, more autonomy. The ratchet only turns one way. Linux users don't think about any of this, and that's the point. When you run Linux, there is no telemetry to disable because there is no telemetry. There are no advertisements to dismiss because there are no advertisements. There is no mandatory account to create because the system doesn't require one. There is no AI photographing your screen because no such feature exists. There are no forced updates because you control when and whether updates are applied. The absence of these things is not a feature in the traditional sense. You won't find no surveillance listed on a Linux distribution's feature page, but it is the single most important characteristic of the platform, and it is the characteristic that, once experienced, makes returning to Windows feel viscerally wrong. People who switch to Linux frequently describe the experience in terms that sound almost emotional. They say it feels clean. They say it feels honest. They say it feels like their computer belongs to them again. These aren't technical assessments. They're responses to a relationship dynamic. For years, their computer was doing things behind their back. Now it isn't. And the relief of that discovery is profound. This is why the migration is quiet. It's not driven by marketing campaigns or viral moments or influencer endorsements. It's driven by individual experiences of relief. One person switches, discovers the difference, and tells someone they trust. That person switches, has the same experience, and tells someone else. The growth is organic, personal, and deeply rooted in lived experience. Microsoft cannot counter this with marketing. You cannot advertise your way out of a trust deficit. You cannot run a commercial that convinces someone their operating system isn't spying on them when they've already seen the privacy settings panel with its dozens of toggles, each one representing a different way Microsoft collects their data. The only way Microsoft could stop the bleeding is by fundamentally changing Windows, removing the telemetry, making accounts optional, eliminating the advertisements, giving users complete control over updates, killing recall permanently, making the operating system a tool, again, instead of a platform for data extraction. They will not do this. They cannot do this, because every single one of those features generates revenue or feeds a business unit that Wall Street expects to grow. The telemetry feeds the AI division. The mandatory accounts feed the cloud services pipeline. The advertisements generate direct revenue. The forced updates ensure engagement metrics stay high. Recall is positioned as a cornerstone of Microsoft's AI integration strategy. Removing these features would mean telling shareholders that Microsoft is deliberately shrinking its revenue streams to make users happy. No publicly traded company does this voluntarily. The structure of corporate incentives makes it impossible. And so the migration continues. Quietly, steadily, one person at a time. Each one discovering the same thing. Each one reaching the same conclusion. There is a better option. It's free, it's fast, and it doesn't treat you like a product. Now I want to talk about the part of this story that even most Linux advocates don't fully appreciate, because everything I've described so far, the performance advantage, the privacy difference, the trust collapse, all of it matters. But none of it explains why this particular moment in time is different from every other moment when people predicted Linux would finally break through on the desktop. People have been saying, this is the year of Linux on the desktop for 20 years. It became a joke, a meme. Every year, someone would write an article claiming Linux was finally ready for mainstream adoption. And every year, nothing meaningfully changed. Windows stayed dominant. Linux stayed niche. The joke wrote itself. But something structurally different is happening right now in 2026 that has never happened before. And it's not one thing. It's the convergence of multiple forces hitting simultaneously, each one reinforcing the others, creating a feedback loop that didn't exist even 3 years ago. The first force is the Windows 10 end of life. This is the single largest forced migration event in the history of personal computing. Microsoft officially ended security support for Windows 10, and the 240 million computers that cannot run Windows 11 need to go somewhere. In previous cycles, the answer was always the same: buy new hardware, get the new Windows. The cycle was predictable, profitable, and unbreakable. This time, the cycle broke. Because this time, the economy is different. Inflation has squeezed household budgets for 3 consecutive years. Consumer electronics spending has flatlined. People are not in the mood to spend $500 on a new laptop because Microsoft decided their current one doesn't have the right chip. The economic conditions that always lubricated the upgrade cycle, disposable income and consumer willingness to spend, are weaker than they've been in over a decade. And this time, the alternative is genuinely ready. Linux Mint in 2026 is not Linux Mint in 2012. The installation is graphical, guided, and virtually foolproof. The desktop is polished and intuitive. The software library between native applications, Flatpaks, snaps, and app images covers virtually every mainstream use case. Hardware compatibility, which was Linux's Achilles heel for decades, has improved to the point where most common laptops and desktops work out of the box without any manual driver installation. The gap between "I need to replace my computer" and "I could just install Linux" has never been narrower, and 240 million people are standing at the edge of that gap right now, looking across. The second force is gaming. I cannot overstate how important this is. For 2 decades, gaming was the lock on the door. You could make every argument in the world for Linux. It's faster, it's freer, it's more private, it's more secure, and a person would listen, nod, and then say, "But I play games." And the conversation was over. Valve changed that. The Steam Deck, running Steam OS, which is Linux, proved that Linux could handle serious gaming. Proton, the compatibility layer that translates Windows game calls into Linux-compatible instructions, matured from an experimental curiosity into a robust, reliable technology that handles thousands of titles. The community at ProtonDB has documented compatibility for the vast majority of popular Steam games, and the list grows weekly. But it's not just Proton. Native Linux game development has accelerated. Engine support from Unity and Unreal Engine means that developers can target Linux without significant additional effort. Indie developers, who often drive innovation in the gaming space, increasingly ship Linux builds alongside Windows versions. The Steam storefront shows a Linux compatibility icon on game pages, normalizing the platform as a gaming target. The door that was locked for 20 years is now open. Not every game works on Linux. Titles with aggressive kernel-level anti-cheat, particularly some competitive multiplayer games, still present compatibility issues, but the percentage of the Steam library that runs on Linux is now large enough that the average gamer can switch without losing access to the games they actually play. The holdouts are shrinking, not growing. The third force is institutional adoption, and this is the force that transforms a consumer trend into an irreversible structural shift. When Denmark announces a national policy to migrate government systems from Windows to Linux, that's not a hobbyist making a personal choice. That's a sovereign nation deciding that dependency on a single foreign corporation for critical infrastructure is an unacceptable national security risk. When Germany's Schleswig-Holstein state commits to replacing Windows with Linux across its entire government administration, that's thousands of workstations, hundreds of departments, millions of documents transitioning to an open-source ecosystem. When France's Gendarmerie, the national police force, runs tens of thousands of machines on Linux and reports improved security and reduced costs, that's a proof of concept at institutional scale. When India develops Boss Linux for government use, and China invests heavily in domestic Linux distributions for government and military applications, that's geopolitical strategy manifesting as operating system policy. These aren't experiments. These are commitments. Commitments backed by budgets, timelines, training programs, and political capital. And each successful institutional migration produces something that no amount of grassroots advocacy ever could. A case study, a documented, verifiable, large-scale demonstration that Linux works, not on a hobbyist's bedroom desktop, in a government, in a police force, in a military, in a school system, at the scale where failure would be catastrophic and therefore where success is unimpeachable proof. These case studies give confidence to the next institution considering the switch. They give ammunition to the IT director arguing for Linux in a corporate boardroom. They give credibility to the school administrator, proposing Linux as a cost-saving measure for an underfunded district. Each migration makes the next one easier, faster, and harder to argue against. The fourth force, and the one that ties everything together, is the cultural shift. Something has changed in how ordinary people talk about their relationship with technology. 5 years ago, complaining about Windows was venting. It was the digital equivalent of complaining about the weather. Everyone did it. Nobody expected change. Windows was a fact of life, like traffic or taxes. You complained, you coped, you continued. The resignation is dissolving. And it's dissolving because people now have a frame of reference. They've seen a friend's laptop running Linux Mint and noticed it was faster than their brand new Windows machine. They've read a Reddit thread where someone described installing Linux on a 10-year-old ThinkPad and using it as a daily driver. They've watched a YouTube video showing a side-by-side boot comparison and felt something shift in their assumptions. The cultural permission to consider alternatives now exists in a way it never did before. Linux is no longer the thing that weird computer guys use. It's the thing that the smart person at the office uses. It's the thing that the tech-savvy nephew installed on grandma's old laptop, and now grandma loves it. It's the thing that governments are choosing. It's the thing that runs the Steam Deck. It's the thing that increasingly just makes sense. And once cultural permission exists, once "have you tried Linux" becomes a normal thing to say instead of a punchline, the adoption curve steepens dramatically. Because the product was always good enough. The barrier was never technical quality. The barrier was social permission. People needed to know it was okay to switch. They needed to know that normal people did it and survived. They needed to see it working in a context they could relate to, not in a server room or a developer's terminal, but on a laptop at a coffee shop, on a desktop in a classroom, on the computer their parent uses to check email and browse recipes. That permission now exists, and it is spreading faster than Microsoft can contain it. So where does this end? Does Linux replace Windows entirely? No, not in the foreseeable future. Windows is too deeply embedded in enterprise infrastructure, in specialized professional software ecosystems, in institutional licensing agreements, and in the massive inertia of billions of users who know it and don't want to change. Windows will remain a dominant platform for years, probably decades, but dominance is not what it used to be. The unquestioned default is becoming a questioned default. The "what else would I use" assumption is being replaced by "should I still be using this" consideration. And for Microsoft, that shift in psychology is more dangerous than any competitor because it transforms every negative experience with Windows from a momentary frustration into a potential conversion event. Every forced update that breaks something becomes a moment where the user thinks, "I could switch." Every advertisement in the start menu becomes a reminder that alternatives exist. Every news story about recall, about telemetry, about mandatory accounts, about failed patches becomes another data point in a growing mental file labeled "reasons to leave." And every person who does leave, who installs Linux and discovers that computing can be fast, clean, private, and pleasant, becomes a permanent defection from Microsoft's user base. Not a temporary experiment, a permanent departure. Because the return rate from Linux to Windows is vanishingly small once you've tasted control over your own machine, accepting corporate. Surveillance dressed as an operating system feels impossible. This is the quiet revolution. It doesn't have a spokesperson. It doesn't have a launch date. It doesn't have a billion-dollar marketing budget. It has something more powerful than all of those things combined. It has the truth of direct experience. The undeniable, visceral, personal truth that your computer can be better than this, faster than this, cleaner than this, more honest than this, more yours than this. And that truth, once discovered, does all the marketing that Linux will ever need. The migration is happening. It's happening right now, one person at a time, one computer at a time, one quiet decision at a time. No fanfare, no announcements. Just people all over the world sitting down at their computers and choosing something better. Microsoft sees the numbers. They know the trajectory. And for the first time in 30 years, they don't have an answer. Because the answer would require them to make Windows good again. And the company they've become won't let them.